Oh, Bob, thank you very much. Good, we're recording. Excellent. Yeah, okay, thank you for that introduction, Bob. And yes, we have collaborated over the years, kind of tag teamed when I was doing research on the War of 1812. And you were, I think, doing your book on the Fenian raids. Anyhow, that was great fun. But anyhow, we don't want to reminisce tonight. What we want to do is learn about rebels on the river. So if you give me a second, I will share screen and get my PowerPoint presentation up, and then we'll head her out. And that didn't work, did it? There we go. Can everybody see that?
Nope.
No.
Nope, not yet.
Nope.
I'm sharing my screen. Nobody can see it?
No.
Is that a screen?
Maybe I'll make you a co-host in case that is necessary.
Shouldn't be.
Try it again.
Okay. Any more luck?
Not yet.
What is going on? Okay, I'm back. I don't understand what's going on there. Well, maybe I didn't do it right. Okay, let's try it again.
I think it's going to work this time. There you go.
Okay. Technical problems on my end. There we go. Okay, Rebels on the River, the American Revolution in Western Nova Scotia. I had to retitle this because my original title was not quite as exciting. It was called New Brunswick, the 13th and a half colony to rebel. But I think this is snappier. And the whole idea of the presentation is to make you aware of this particular aspect of the American Revolution, which is otherwise not well known.
Okay, that's what it is.
And maybe I could ask everybody to mute their mics. And it's kind of appropriate to talk about this because as you know, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is coming up in 2026. And I think all events surrounding the revolution are of interest, including this one. And I've been trying to put a push on, especially in the tourism industry in New Brunswick, that they should pick this up as an advertising feature. And I think it'd be great to attract American tourists, especially those coming in on the cruise ships. But so far things have fallen on deaf ears, but we've got a couple of years to go, so we're okay. Now, one thing I like to do in this presentation, if there's people with roots along the lower St. John River, is to tease them about who they would join. Are they going to join the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada, or the Daughters of the American Revolution, or perhaps both? And when I'm done tonight, you'll understand why people have the option. Every good presentation starts with a map. You've got to christen the ground. So if there's Machias, we'll talk about Machias. Place up here called Moose Island. I'm not sure who lives there now. Come up the Passamaquoddy Bay to Musquash Cove. We'll mention that. Port Frederick at the mouth of the St. John River, present site of St. John. Up the St. John River to Majorville, Ocpac, Meductic, First Yale River Portage Route, Oromocto River Portage Route, come back down the river, come up the Bay of Fundy to Chignecto Bay, Shippity Point, we'll mention that, and of course, Fort Cumberland. Yeah. And at this point in time, there was no New Brunswick. What you had was Sunbury County, Western Nova Scotia, which encompassed all of present day
I have to try it on this one.
New Brunswick. Now, one thing I'm going to mention is the course of the revolution in the northern 13 states, because that very much affected the resources that were available for any operations against Sunbury County and against Nova Scotia. So just to go through it, 1775, you want to be rebels or patriots? I'll be nice, I'll call you patriots. Invaded Quebec. They, in two phases, and they were quite convinced that Quebec would throw off its British yoke and the French-speaking inhabitants would join the cause. That didn't work so well. Anyhow, they had the British all hold up here in Quebec City. I don't like the way this mouse disappears. And then in 1776, when the ice went out of the St. John River, the British arrived with reinforcements and pushed the Patriots all the way back, at least as far as Crown Point. Also in 1776, in May of 1776, the British evacuated Boston. And then later in that year in July, they came back and occupied New York. The following year in 1777, Burgoyne pushed south along the Hudson River. And the intent was to join up with Howe, who was down in New York, and basically isolate the New England states from the southern states. That didn't go well because, as you know, he was defeated at the Battle of Saratoga in September, October 1777. This led to a momentous shift in the course of the revolution, because in 1778, of course, you had the treaty between the Americans and France, and that turned everything around. And the reason I mention all this is with all the activity going on here, this was the focus of operations in the New England area. And it really affected the resources available for operations in Western Nova Scotia. So this is what the St. John River area looked like in terms of settlement following the end of the 7 Years' War in 1760, also known as the French and Indian Wars. You know, so you had settlement down here at the mouth of the river, planters along the river, up as far as Majorville, and just have another look at that here. So you had what I'm going to call the merchants down at the mouth of the river. And this was a firm of Simons, Hayes, and Anoy. They ran a trading post and a truck house being a trading post that catered to the indigenous people. So they were into masting operations, selling barrel staves, you name it, furs, they sold it. And as I mentioned, the planters lived along the river with the, I guess, the major part of their settlement being up around Majorville. Farther up, you had Ocpac, which is where the Wolastoqiyik or the Maliseet had their village. And just above that, you had an Acadian settlement that had sort of coalesced out of the dispersed Acadians. And it's sort of in the location of the present day village of French Village. So that's who you had along the St. John River. Now, there were competing loyalties, just like there were competing loyalties everywhere else in the 13 colonies. The Wolastoqiyik or the Maliseet, they had a foot in both camps. Grand Chief Pierre Toma led the pro-British faction. And I wish I could say he was firmly British, but he wasn't. He wavered from time to time, depending on what offers are on the table. Whereas Chief Ambrose St. Aubin was staunchly pro-patriot through the whole course of the American Revolution. The New England planters, as we will learn, were mostly pro-patriot. They had come from the New England states. They had close ties with their friends and family back there, and they had very similar thoughts. Not surprising, the New England merchants down at the mouth of the river were pro-British because their business depended on working with the British government for selling products, buying merchandise, things like that. And as far as you can tell, the Acadians who were living up in the French settlement area or the French village area were mostly neutral. I think they had had enough of everything the first time around. So the American Revolution broke out. And the first thing that happened was privateers arrived at the mouth of the St. John River. And apparently they were mainly from Machias, Maine, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But anyhow, they raided the trading post. They burnt Fort Frederick, and that wasn't hard to do because there were only 4 people watching the fort at the time, because the concentration of British forces in Boston had drawn down all the British forces elsewhere in Nova Scotia. And they captured a ship with British supplies on board. And there's Fort Frederick before it went up in flames. And if you're familiar with St. John, it was located about where the toll plaza for the Harbor Bridge was, but it's gone now, and so is the fort. So rebellion was in the air. Many Nova Scotians were in sympathy with the 13 colonies, again, because of ties of family, friends, and business. And many of them actively petitioned Massachusetts for aid. And things were getting quite concerning for the British authorities. So to help quell the unrest, Governor Francis Lake of Nova Scotia declared martial law on the 5th of December, 1775. And that sort of helped put a lid on things. But some of the more outspoken agitators to join the rebellion were 2 people called Jonathan Eddy and John Allan, both who came from the area around Fort Cumberland. They had bounties placed on their heads and they had to flee to Massachusetts. In fact, Machias. So in May of 1776, while all this was going on, a couple of privateer ships reached Majorville. And they suggested in fairly strong terms that it would be to the advantage of the settlers there to declare themselves for the revolution prior to the planned invasion. And that is what they did. They met on the 14th of May, 1776, declared themselves for the revolution, and placed themselves under the protection of Massachusetts. And the vote was 125 out of 137 for. And one of the leaders, or a couple of the leaders of the settlement were Reverend Seth Noble and a chap called Jacob Barker. So there we have it. On the 14th of May, 1776, the 13th and a half colony had rebelled. Excuse me. So I mentioned areas of rebel sympathy in the area. Well, the first one obviously was around Major. Around Sackville, where Eddie and Allan had lived and had to flee. Up in the Cobequid area where the Cobequid Pass bypass is, and down in Cumberland County. And there was also unrest amongst the New England planters in the Windsor area, the Cornwallis-Windsor area. And of course, there were others down, in the Liverpool area, things like that. It was relatively widespread. So let's talk about the first invasion of Nova Scotia. And that was led by Colonel Jonathan Eddy. So he left Machias about the 14th of October, 1776. Apparently picked up a few people in the Passamaquoddy Bay area around, I guess, what would be St. Andrews today, and moved up to Majorville. And they were traveling by canoe and whaleboats, not a great flotilla. And I'll talk about where they got their reinforcements a bit later on. From there, they moved down to Sympathy that I had mentioned earlier. There was a British outpost there that they captured on the 29th of October. Their next big move was on the 8th of November when they captured the Polly. The Polly was a British supply boat that had brought the winter stores to the garrison at Fort Cumberland. But you'll notice there's a gap in time between the 29th of October and the 8th of November. And the rebels just weren't sitting around smoking and joking. Eddy was very busy gathering recruits in the area, and he was quite successful, as we will see. Now, the interesting thing is, given the fact there were so many rebels in the area, apparently the British garrison at Fort Cumberland was not aware of their presence until the Polly was captured on the 8th of November. And with the cat out of the bag, Eddy besieged Fort Cumberland on the 10th of November, 1776. And it was a stalemate. As you can see on the rebel or the patriot side, about 26 people from Massachusetts, picked up 27 from Majorville, the lowest Stockawick, 17, including Chief Oben, Ambrose St. Oben. In the area around Fort Cumberland, they had 4 Mi'kmaq joined them, 21 Acadians, 25 men from Quebec, 88 from Cumberland, and 9 from Pictou. So they gave Allan about 217 people. On the British side, the garrison consisted of the Royal American Fencibles under Colonel Gorham, but he was losing people fast. He started out with 268 soldiers. He lost 15 when Sympathy was captured. He lost more when the Polly was captured. So he was down to about 200 people or so. And it was, again, a stalemate. The Patriots didn't have the strength to storm the fort, nor did they have cannon to mount a siege. Meanwhile, the British really didn't have the manpower to do a sortie. Plus, the Royal American Fencibles were fairly young troops, fairly raw troops, and Gorham did not know how they would perform in battle. So he sat behind the walls of Fort Cumberland and managed to get messages out to Halifax asking for reinforcements. And these came in the form of 89 Royal Marines and 124 men of the Highland Emigrants Regiment, which, when they got there, gave him a 2-to-1 numerical advantage. And based on this, he sortied on the 29th of November and put the rebels to flight. And this map gives you a bit of an idea of the movements I described. Leaving Machias, St. John, Majorville, Sympathy, Fort Cumberland. Then they retreated over the portage route, through a lake Washamagowick. Never say that. Back to Majorville. And after a period of time there, they retreated back to Machias through the Eel River portage route. And here's an image of Fort Cumberland. If you drive along the Trans-Canada Highway into Nova Scotia, it's right on your right at Olac. Nice place to visit. So there's a power vacuum along the St. John River, and the British returned in May of 1777. Colonel Goold came. He was accompanied by Major Studholme and a detachment of soldiers. And among other things they wanted to do was prevent Allan from establishing a truck house, because this is one of the things that the indigenous allies, the Wolastoqiyik, wanted. They wanted a place to trade, get European goods, and especially European ammunition and powder. So Goold offered the settlers and the Wolastoqiyik the opportunity to pledge alliance to King George III. And by and large, they did. And you would think at that point in time, the rebellion would be effectively over. Not so fast. Because what happened is the British left the St. John River again, leaving a power vacuum. By this time, Colonel John Allan, who we heard of before, became the superintendent of the Eastern Indians. And his mandate was to protect the settlements of Eastern Massachusetts, prevent the British from using the grand communications route that Bob had alluded to, and more importantly, to free Nova Scotia from British control. So 1777, what was going on in 1777 in the larger scheme of things? Oh yes, Burgoyne was moving south from Fort Ticonderoga. Nonetheless, Allan set off from Machias, arrived in St. John about the 2nd of June, 1777 with 27 men. Captured the trading post there, and he left Captain West in a small garrison. He then proceeded upriver to Outback, and while there he continued intelligence gathering in the area, information about British movements, and also worked to try to convince the Wolastoqiyik to come firmly on the American side. And he was reinforced by Colonel Shaw with another 40 men. But the promised regiment of 1,500 men never materialized. Again, because of Burgoyne's march south. On the 30th of June, Studholme came back with 120 troops, did an assault landing at Musquash Cove and routed west, and West retreated upriver. The next day, Colonel Michael Franklin, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for Nova Scotia, arrived with 150 troops. So the British proceeded upriver. Captain West retreated along the Oromocto Portage route back to Machias, and the main body of the British proceeded up to Allan's camp at Outback, which they captured on the 6th of July, 1777. Now, most of Allan's men were not in the camp because they were off at a place referred to as Mazero's Barn, probably up around French Village, where they were yet again in conference with the Wolastoqiyik. As a result of the British attack on their camp, Allan and his indigenous allies retreated to Machias. And there's a fair contingent of them. There's something like 27 canoes retreated along the Eel River route to Machias. And again, going back to this map, from Machias to St. John, there's the assault landing skirmish at Musquash Bay, up to Outback, and then back here. Interesting, in this invasion, Allan didn't seem to have too many dealings with the settlers along the river. I guess he didn't want to bring British wrath down on them should they come back. Although some of the leading notables, such as Seth Noble, met with them and talked with them. Now, one of the things people ask me about other times I've done this is, well, what did the British do about Machias? Because Machias was clearly a thorn in their side. Well, Machias first came to prominence in June of 1775. The British went up to purchase timber to build barracks for the troops in Boston, and they were driven off, and the Marguerite was captured. And this is advertised as the Naval Lexington and Concord, and it was also apparently the first naval battle of the Revolution. And that pretty much stirred up the inhabitants of Machias against the British. Moving forward to August 1777, Burgoyne is still moving south. Allan is retreating, and in either the papers of Allan or Eddie, the British received intelligence about the fact that, excuse me, the rebels were going to mount yet another invasion. And apparently the British wanted to capture any supplies at Machias that might have been intended for the next Patriot attack on Fort Cumberland. And it was a bit of a tie from what I could tell. Both sides claimed victory. Colonel Eddy led the defense using local militia with indigenous allies. For their part, it was mostly it was a naval expedition on behalf of the British. And they only had 153 Marines to do any action on land. So it was not really a serious attempt to capture Machias, but they did try to do something to deal with that thorn in their side. So back to the St. John River. Privateers came back again. And this time it was a chap called a Green Crabtree. Wonderful name. He raided the trading post at the mouth of the river in November of 1777. And again, the traders there, Hazen, White, and Simons, petitioned Halifax for assistance. And that came quite quickly because later in the month, Studholme came back with a small force and a prefabricated blockhouse, which he put together on a high ground in the harbor and called Fort Howe. And there was now a permanent garrison at the mouth of the river. Crabtree apparently returned, looking for some easy pickings. When he saw the fort and the cannon, he decided he would go somewhere else. And then the following spring, more reinforcements arrived in response to reports of a third invasion. Meanwhile, Allan continued to set the wall of Scotia against the British. He was constantly trying to convince them to come over to the British side. And then they might have been a deciding factor if they had. The one thing that's intriguing about this whole period is the subject of treaties and counter treaties. Oh, there's Fort Howe. So the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, ended in 1760, and the British and the Wolastoqiyik and the Mi'kmaq signed a treaty of peace and friendship. And that should have made sure that there was peace within the river. As soon as the revolution broke out, George Washington made many efforts, many overtures to the indigenous people to entice them to his side. In fact, apparently the first treaty that the new American government signed was the Treaty of Watertown in 1776 with the Wabanaki, and by Wabanaki, I'm talking with the Abenaki, the Passamaquoddy, the Wolastoqiyik, and the Mi'kmaq. And part of this is that the Wabanaki would provide 600 fighters to be part of a combined regiment for the Continental Army, and the remainder of the regiment would be made up of New Englanders. That never came to pass. And then we have the, the American-French Treaty of 1778. And again, Allan used this to try to align the Wolastoqiyik with the rebels. You know, they had been pro-French during the French regime and anti-British, and he was trying to reinforce these old alliances to work on behalf of the Americans. And although there was a lot of talk and a lot of gifts exchanged, I don't think much really amounted from it. However, he seemed to have some success because in September of 1778, there was a war party of 90 canoes proceeding down the St. John River and by all intents intending to attack Fort Howe. The deputy Indian agent for the area, a chap by the name of White, intercepted them at Long Reach along the river and convinced them to come back at the end of the month to a peace and treaty conference that happened at Fort Howe on the 24th of September. So they came back and there was a typical exchange of gifts, speeches, and the Wolastoqiyik and the Mi'kmaq renewed their loyalty and renounced any treaties with the rebels. And they also gave back the gifts that the Americans had bestowed on them, including a belt of wampum personally sent by George Washington. So they were quite serious about renewing their loyalty with the British. So what happened after this? Well, Allan continued to incite unrest, but with limited success. On the British side, it opened up the grand communications route for troop and courier movements. And the first group over this route was a naval party going to man ships up in the Quebec area. Fort Hughes was built in 1780, and this was at the mouth of the Oromocto River around Oromocto today. And it had a couple of major purposes. The first one was to protect the logging and masting operations, to be sure there was no interference by Allan. And in my opinion, it also might have helped to remind the settlers of their loyalties. Those loyalties having been tested not too long ago. And there's Fort Hughes, a rebuilt blockhouse in Oromocto. Doesn't look too authentic, does it? Now we talked about the Grand Communications Route. And basically it's a strategic communications route from the Bay of Fundy up to the St. Lawrence River. The major way that the British and the French before them communicated with Quebec and other areas around here was along the St. Lawrence River, but unfortunately it was closed to navigation 5 or 6 months of the year. So this meant that the Grand Communications Route was important for the passage of messages by courier and also for troop movements, as happened during the War of 1812, the rebellions of 1837 to 38, and the Trent Affair of 1861. And if you read the book, The Aroostook War of 1839, you'll understand the efforts and the lengths the British went to maintain control of this key part of the route. So to sum this all up, Western Nova Scotia rebelled. And there were the two invasions. And the goal, of course, was to add Nova Scotia to the Patriot cause. And as I pointed out, they were greatly under-resourced because this theater was of secondary importance because the main events were happening farther to the west. Sunbury County was retained for the Crown. And as far as I know, this is the only area where a spontaneous rebellion had been successfully suppressed. And as I pointed out, there were various factors influencing the inhabitants. Would they be loyal to the British? Would they join the American cause? Could they stay neutral? And all of the trials and tribulations that inhabitants throughout the other 13 colonies were experiencing. You know, do you rebel? Do you stay loyal? And as about 50% of them wanted to do, can I stay neutral? And obviously, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. So one thing to think about, if you were living along the St. John River Valley, what would you have done? It's an interesting question to ask. Reading suggestions. Bob had mentioned The Road to Canada. I highly recommend it. I know the author very well. And if you read it, it'll give you a good idea of the whole military history of the route I described. And much of my presentation is in the early chapters of that. A couple of other books, The River St. John by Raymond, very good description of the events up until the end of the American Revolution. And if you want to know more about the siege of Fort Cumberland, I recommend Ernest Clark's book. And in the annexes, it has a complete listing of everybody on the Patriot side and everybody on the British side who was there. A great reference book. If historical fiction is more to your liking, I can recommend His Majesty's Yankees by Riddell. The protagonist is out of Liverpool, but he eventually shows up at Cumberland at some point. And Embers of War is a similar story, only it's based out of the Majorville settlement. So interesting reading. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm open for any questions you might have. And we'll just stop the sharing here. Worked. Thank you. You've been so attentive.
If anyone would like to ask a question, unmute yourself. I know there were some comments in the chat.
Yeah. Let me just see if I can find them. And I do apologize for my voice. For some reason I get. So what do we got
There's
here?
something going around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the chats, we have the York Sunday program tonight. Yes. The Holy War of Bishop John Richardson.
That's what it was. And hopefully it'll be recorded.
It will be, I think. We're having some issues with that because many of the people speaking are graduate students and they don't want their research out there before they're ready for it. Okay, Kenneth talking about his ancestor, Captain Robert Avery. Yeah. In fact, I was at Machias a few years ago and I was doing a book tour, and it's a bit of a challenge to get past the fort there up the river.
Do you have any corroborating evidence of a Joseph Neptune having grabbed a rifle from an inept rifleman and fired the shot that made the British leave the dike area of Machias? And that my friend Dwayne Toma of the Passamaquoddy tribe has told me that the word Machias means bad shot.
That I do not. I don't.
Also, that the Passamaquoddies wrote a letter to George Washington, and apparently were the first to volunteer their services to George Washington. So that's part of Eastport area, probably St. Andrews, too, Passamaquoddy history that has a document to justify.
And I think he replied to them. I think there's a letter from George Washington to the Passamaquoddies.
There are. I've been collecting some of those documents because James Avery, Robert Avery's son, was the liaison to the Passamaquoddy, and there are documents that you can find in the National Archives written back and forth. He requested a priest to take care of the Passamaquoddies because most of the war fighters were Catholic, and Washington, appointed someone. So there were a bunch of correspondence going back and forth to Washington and Congress to take care of things.
Are you able to post those documents? That would be very interesting.
I'll do that. I've got there on my computer, and my brain is focused on a lot of other things. So
Can we, the Border Historical Society has a blog, so perhaps you could post on there.
I'll do that.
If we have a Facebook page, but Facebook isn't searchable by the wider, population, so the blog is better.
I've got petition from Andrew Harrington the First. He was a planter up there in the Canning area near Jemseg, and the petition talks about having been bumped off his land with all the fighting that was going on, and he wanted compensation from Governor Carleton. I think he was playing a bunch of land games because he also had retreated to Deer Island where he had land, and then a couple of years before Shackford, he was on Moose Island. So, and Andrew, his location there on Moose Island, I guess the Crown referred to it as a prime smuggling part of the island. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, Kenneth, you're absolutely right. I didn't get into it, but if you read some of the journals at the time that have been republished, the Americans, George Washington was very active in trying to recruit Native allies. And Eddie, I think, went as far as to visit the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. You know, they were trying to gain support for their activities at the highest levels they could.
You mentioned in there about Hazen, Simmons, and White, and
Yes.
Hazen's brother Moses fought on the Continental side in the Revolution. I think the other brother William, I think it is, he remained loyal to the Crown. So there were two brothers there fighting different sides, and Moses Hazen, my wife's ancestors, fought in his regiment. They were French Canadians with First Nation roots, and they were known as Hazen's Infernals because they were wicked, crazy fighters.
Mhm.
And if I'm not mistaken, Moses Hazen had a bit of a black reputation on the St. John River.
He did.
Because he led the party of Rangers that burnt St. Anne's Point, the site of present-day Fredericton, and killed some of the French or some of the Acadians he found out of hand,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a black mark on him. But he was known to be rather vicious.
Pam, can you identify where John Allen lived on some island off the coast of Eastport?
Treats Island.
Treats Island.
Yeah, well, that's where the cenotaph, I don't know, he might have lived other places, but he had a trading post there because he traded after the war with Benedict Arnold, who lived on Campobello.
He's buried there, Pam.
Well, it was
He's buried on Treat Island.
People say it's a cenotaph, Bob, but you hear he's actually buried there?
I'll stand to your version.
Well, I
thought
don't-
he was buried there.
There's a monument, but people say it's a cenotaph.
Okay, I thought it was a
And
grave. It
there
sure
are
looks
some,
like one.
Yeah,
there are some excavated house cellars on Treats Island too.
yeah, that might have been his trading post.
And not to mention a Civil War fortification.
Ah,
In one of Ken's comments, he mentions Lieutenant Pierre Boileau or Boileau. Is that an ancestor of our friend?
Pierre Boulot was my wife's ancestor who fought with Hazen's regiment.
Well, there's an author in Halifax named John Boileau. How do you pronounce it, Gary?
Wallow.
Boileau?
That's
Yep.
how I say it. Bob, how do you say it?
John Below is who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's a fellow soldier.
Do you think this Lieutenant Pierre Boileau might be an ancestor of his?
He could be a distant relative. That's an old French Canadian family, and they also it's a Métis family, so there are
Oh.
connections to the Wendat and other nations.
John Below is from Moncton.
Yeah, okay. I should be used to the pronunciations with St. John, but how did Majorville, how did that pronunciation come about?
As far as I know, just the way it is. John Major was the Nova Scotia agent in London, and he was instrumental in getting the land grants for the New England planters. So they named their settlement in his honor.
And was his name spelled Mauger?
Yes, it was.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Are
Used
there
to drive one of
lists?
my,
Oh, sorry. I was
Go
going to
ahead.
say, are there lists of those planters who went to that area on the St. John?
well, funny you should ask that. After the revolution was over, Studholme commissioned a census of everybody along the river. And in that, he indicated how long they'd been there, how much land they had, maybe a bit about animals, and what they had done during the war, whether they'd gone out with the rebels or if they'd stayed loyal or if they'd sort of switched back and forth. And it's available online. It was published in the Journal of the New Brunswick Historical Society about 1900, but it's available online. If you Google Studholme census, you'll probably pick it up.
I have that, and it misses Andrew Harrington, but I did get a map with, there were 7 plots of land that sort of fall in between the major proprietors that had big grants up there, and that's where Andrew had his original land grant.
Yeah. Now, those large grants I showed you on the initial map, a lot of them, what is the right word? Escheated, because they never did settle or make good on their promises to develop the land. So it reverted to the crown, and then that's how it came to belong to the planters.
Did we talk about Jim's question about what happened to Captain Jabez West?
We did not. I have absolutely no idea.
I noticed Holly mentions Eddington, and my friend's apartment overlooks a statue of Jonathan Eddy in Eddington.
Yeah. Don't know what happened to West. You know, I suppose you could Google him and see if he pops up. You gotta love Google. You can find just about anything on Google.
Well, whenever I Google them, they mention everybody that was underneath his command there, but they don't mention too much about him. And I lost any information after him after 1779.
That book that Gary, that you mentioned, a book where someone mentioned all the names of the people.
Yes.
Do you think there might be something about Jabez West in that book?
Unless he was part of the force that attacked Fort Cumberland, he wouldn't be mentioned. That
Okay.
list of names is just for those involved in the siege of Fort Cumberland.
Anybody else want to unmute and ask a question?
Here's another fun fact. James Avery, who I mentioned, he passed away rather young, and his widow married Lemuel Trescott, Colonel Trescott, who the little town near Eastport's named after. And
Who was instrumental in Fort Sullivan.
Yep.
Yes, in the construction of Fort Sullivan.
What year was Fort Sullivan constructed, Pam?
1808.
And
Yeah,
were
there's
the
a lot of-
Passamaquoddies divided in their loyalties between being loyal to the crown and being interested in independence? Was there a schism within the tribes at that time?
If there was, I haven't come across it. In fact, they don't figure very large at all in the narrative. Other than, as was said, Washington was courting them. And they also apparently provided some people to the Eddy Rebellion. But I don't have the details on them because they're It's not well known.
And the repulsing of the British at Machias and the Margaretta.
Yes. Mhm.
You'd enjoy Margaretta days in June.
Mhm.
My ancestor, Nathaniel Reynolds, was a neighbor of Eddie's and Allan's around Cumberland, and he's in that book on the siege. He and Eddie and the others had to leave. Many of them left their families in the area. Their children and their wives had to stay behind. Only the ones of military age escaped to Machias. And I'm wondering about sources for the families that were up there, anything of that sort. His oldest son was married to someone that was a British official's daughter. And so he stayed up there. And I know several of the children, including my direct ancestor, the youngest child, was with him. And he moved down onto land in Lubec that Nathaniel Reynolds got for his participation in both of the sieges of the fort. But I'm wondering if you know of any records about the families that were left behind when these New Englanders had to get out.
Not a whole lot, other than after Eddie retreated from Fort Cumberland, the British forces burnt the houses and barns of the rebels they were aware of, and maybe some they weren't aware of, which turned the families out in the cold with winter coming on, and apparently they had a rough go of it.
Yes, Nathaniel Reynolds' wife, Lydia, died, and the three youngest children that were with her at the time went and lived with the oldest son, as best I've been able to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, if you had somebody who was willing to take you in, you weren't too badly off. But if you had no one to take you in, quite likely died from exposure. You know, war is difficult on families.
Was John Allan born in England or in America or in Canada?
I don't know, but I suspect probably in England. You know, I'd have to check. If you go to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, that's an online publication, and look them up. It will tell you all about them.
Hi there. I think I can answer that question. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, actually in the castle itself. His father was a major. Yeah, and then that's how they got to Nova Scotia.
Wow.
Cool.
He's my 6th great grandfather.
Awesome. And Linda's going to do a presentation on him in the future.
Oh, nice.
Well, yeah, my cousin and I are working hard on that. We really are. Yeah.
Can't
But
wait.
I've gotten a lot of valuable information tonight. I really, really have. Thank you.
Yes,
Great.
most enjoyable.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Hello, it's Ron Richard in St. Andrews. I wonder if Mr. Campbell or Dr. Campbell would say something about the effects of the upon the Planters Society in the St. John Valley, the New Englanders, of the arrival of the Loyalists. Because I know a great many of them didn't want to give up their holdings even though they haven't developed them. And this meant that the Loyalists were holed up in, well, many of them were holed up in St. John. And I believe that there was a general movement north, especially of the French, the Acadians, to the upper parts of the valley. Perhaps Dr. Campbell might comment on this. Thank you.
Well, you're right about the Acadians. There were Acadian settlements just on the Kennebecasis River, and the other one I mentioned above Fredericton. And some of them held legal land grants, others were squatters. And when the Loyalists came in, they weren't taking prisoners. They wanted the land because they'd just been forced out of their own homes. So the Acadians, not liking the way the neighborhood was going, up stakes and moved up to the Edmundston area. And that's because during the latter part of the Revolutionary War, the Acadians had worked as couriers between St. John and Quebec City, and they were aware of the good land up there around Madawaska. And that's why they moved up. I'm not so sure about what happened between the Loyalists and the planters. I expect there was friction because, you know, the planters were perhaps a bit suspect because of their past history, having rebelled. But I really don't know if they got forced out or learned to live with the newcomers. I really don't know.
But in one account I read, it was proposed that the French Canadians were afraid of the of kind of free-loving loyalists, and were afraid of corruption. So the upstation went up to the Edmonton area. But this may be factitious. I don't know.
I hadn't heard that one.
Well, if there are no more questions, then I'm going to say that was a fabulous presentation. Love the maps, always love the maps. And I really appreciate it, Gary, that you shed some American Revolution era light on this. And I'm just looking for the last, just lots of